Yeah, as I said, our next panel, the seventh panel in this entire conference is the next generation of macroeconomists. So our chair is Claudius Gräbner, and sorry, did I pronounce that wrong?
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. So thank you very much, Claudius, for being here. So Claudius is a PI at Rebuilding Macro with a fascinating project as well. He has experience in exploring economics, but also he's a research associate at both two centers of research in Germany and Austria. So it's amazing to have him chairing this panel and trying to get all the insights we need from the next generation of economists. So Claudius, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Karina, thank you very much for the invitation. So as a chair, I also welcome everybody officially to this session. As already said, I'm Claudius. I'm actually the replacement only for Kahal Moran, who cannot unfortunately be here because of health issues. The main protagonists today are other people anyway. So I just want to introduce quickly our now 3 remaining panelists, and then I would proceed with the session as planned, and I will quickly say some words about that. First, we will hear from Abdoulaye. I hope I pronounced it correctly again. He's assistant professor of economics at the Leonard Stern School of Business in New York. He holds a PhD from the Northwestern University, and he was a visiting scholar at various very prestigious institutions such as Harvard, United Nations, Princeton University. He was research economist at Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So quite very amazing stuff he has done. His main research is on macroeconomics and public finance, and he has some very interesting working papers on his webpage on taxes and government redistribution and insurance policies, and on compensation schemes of firms. After Abdul, we will hear something from my dear colleague Daniel Obst, who is a long-lasting member of the German Network for Pluralism in Economics. And he did something quite notably. He founded the e-learning platform exploringeconomics.org, where you can really can practice pluralism by having a comparative look and comparative introduction to various different schools of economic thought. And when preparing the session, I was informed that this webpage is accessed by over 24,000 people from 175 countries every month. So this is really a great and inclusive project. And I'm always wondering how he's still doing his PhD on the influence of inequality and individual decision-making. Obviously also at the University of Duisburg-Essen at the Institute for Socio-Economics. And then our third panelist will be Cecilia Rikap. She's a researcher at the National Research Council of Argentina. She's also affiliated with many prestigious universities. I probably will pronounce incorrectly: the Université de Paris and the Université de Technologie de Champagne. So probably not exactly. She's also a lecturer at the University of Buenos Aires, and she is the outgoing coordinator of the States and Markets Working Group of the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. She's also a board member of the Friends of Epoch Association, which is, if I'm informed correctly, a fascinating educational program. I'm pretty sure she will inform us a little bit more about that later on, but I think this is highly recommended. And in her teaching, she has also done some very interesting work on economics of science, technology, innovation, IPE, and Marxian economics. I think all of the 3 speakers here have many interesting things to say. It's a shame that they will only have 10 minutes each for their initial presentation. I might not be that strict because we are 1 speaker less, but I would kindly ask you to keep your time with the 10 minutes. I will inform you via the chat about the remaining time. And I'm also inviting the audience to raise questions through the chat, to address them to me, so I can then pass them on to the panelists. and so they can respond. I also invite the panelists to ask questions to each other, so you will get a little bit priority in order to get into an actual conversation. And I also prepared some questions myself, but I think probably that there will be too many interesting questions from the audience and from yourself, so that I will get the chance to ask them, which is actually a good thing, I would say. So enough of the talk. Let's talk about the future of macroeconomics by some future senior macroeconomists. So I would invite Abdu to start with your 10 minutes presentation. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Claudius, and hi everyone. Thank you. I imagine most people are in the UK. I'm in New York now, where it's the morning here. So there is a bit of a time difference. So the future of macroeconomics, the next generation. So my name is Abdu, as Claudius introduced, and I'm in New York, assistant professor. But I want to talk today about something I've been involved that speaks about the future generation of macroeconomists. One aspect in which we researchers which is very important for our careers, and also what defines what are the topics that are in broad light that are more important within macroeconomics is access to conferences and conference presentations. So I was involved in the once the Society for Economic Dynamics meetings have been canceled because of COVID-19. We thought of what is the best way to go forward, and there was a need to have a major virtual conference. So that's where the virtual macroeconomics seminars came in, and where they realized also that there was a kind of a bias towards more senior and very well established researchers presenting their work. So they thought of organizing a junior conference as well, and we volunteered to be part of the program committee. And in volunteering being part of the program committee, one aspect that was important realizing is that there is a trade-off once you're organizing a conference between just selecting papers by reputation of the people who are the authors of these papers to make sure you have a high quality conference versus having equal access for many people and people who are lesser known to have the opportunity to show their work. So in the past, being in program committees, I had done a blind review of papers when I was in committees. So I decided why, and I found the experience to be interesting. So I suggested this to my co-program members and said, okay, let's try to design a blind review of other papers. And the goal of this process was twofold. Was first to have a conference that was high quality, in which you would have good representation of good papers and good topics presented. And the second one was also to have, equal opportunity of access for people, not to just be limited by the name of the institution in which they work for, or whether they are known in the profession or not. And this is also a problem for many junior economists. So also having equitable access. So in doing that, we designed a process that I want to talk about and show you the results and kind of to think through what works or not in improving macroeconomics broadly for the future generation. So we designed a process that were two steps. In the first step, we blinded all the papers and reviewed them blindly and selected 2/3 of the papers that would be presented completely blindly by blinding the submissions, so that the authors, neither the reviewer nor the authors knew who were on the other side. And from after that first step, the second step, another third of the papers involved some deliberation. We finally unveiled the names of the authors in the first step and looked at the gender and minority composition of these groups. And we selected the second tier of second group of papers, which were called the papers for consideration after deliberation. And in this second step, we prioritized women, we prioritized underrepresented minorities, and we prioritized junior researchers in the second step. So this was the process that we took in this double-blind review. So the result of the paper of the conference in general, what we had was that overall, the conference we accepted we had large amount of submissions, so we accepted 14% of the papers. So this is on par with the selective conferences. So that was substantive. And now I want to talk about some of the results that we had in terms of quality of the conference and equal representation, which were our two objectives. So I'm gonna share my screen, if I'm allowed, yes. So the first involved the quality of the conference. So we wrote this article on Vox EU. So we found that overall the conference, we had a lot of great feedback on the quality of the conference, that we didn't lose anything in terms of quality. There was a large, so this is a cloud plot, like a word cloud of the different, most of the words. So you see that when a lot of macro conferences focused a lot on these very kind of approaches that are like either new Keynesian or looking at just monetary policy, we had a very diverse set of topics that were talked about: consumption, credits, macroeconomics, inequality, and we have a very diverse array of topics that were considered: gender, values, some labor issues and so on. Really, because macroeconomics is what macroeconomists do. Once you have a more diverse set of people presenting their work, you will have a broader set of topics that will be represented. So overall, in terms of quality and also in terms of costs of implementing this process, there wasn't any loss whatsoever, and people really appreciated the quality of the conference. And in terms of institutional representation, which is also one part of the equal access part, we saw also very diverse institutional representation, names that are more, so the name that was most common was the University of Toronto, for example, where in a conference like this, most of the time you would have MIT and Harvard people presenting. So you see a large representation of people from Sciences Po, University of Amsterdam, Warwick, a very diverse set of universities, as you can see, not just some common names like what people call the top 10 that would be represented. So it was really an international conference where you have very large representation. So in terms of quality of the conference and institutional representation, we were very satisfied with the results. However, the lesson that we learned for the representation of women were still not great. And one of the reasons is that these are issues that have to be addressed more broadly, I think, earlier on than at the submission. In the conference, what we found was that we had around 20% of the submissions were from women, and the acceptance rate was around 16.7% of the acceptance was women. So, which means like around same acceptance rate once you account for the fact that there, as men, that there were less submissions from women. So you need to incentivize more submissions from women, or you can work with this number of papers that you'll be looking at, paper for consideration, which was 1/3 for our concerns, which you could increase. And also in terms of graduate students participating in the conference, we had 37.5% of accepted papers were either from grad students or people presenting their job market papers. So we had very good representation in terms of seniority versus less senior people for a junior conference. So we were very happy for that. Also, we didn't have much in terms of representation for underrepresented minorities. Actually, even after our looking at unveiling the identity in our second step, there were no paper that was submitted by someone from an underrepresented minority defined. My paper was in the program, but it was submitted by my co-author, and that was already accepted in the blind review part of the paper, of the process. So overall, the lessons that we learned from here is that, and also another aspect was also talking about online participation in online conferences. So this is always difficult. What we found was that in breakout rooms, there were more participation than in the main presentation. So this is also important, you know, because one part of also making macroeconomics more accessible is also the kind of informal network conversation that you have. And so thinking of also how online conferences can emulate the real world. So overall, in summary, we find that, and we wanted to make the point that double-blind review can be very useful, and it's not as costly, can be very useful for having a broad institutional representation in conferences, which is very important, and also keeping the quality of the conference on par as other methods. And also there is more work to be done. It's not just a bulletproof solution to problems of equal representation of women and also underrepresented minorities. So I'm going to stop here, and I will answer more questions later on broadly on the question of the next generation of macroeconomists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for both the interesting insights and the keeping your time. I would say we proceed directly to the next presentation, and then we will have all questions dedicated to all of you. I think that's going to be more productive. So the next speaker in the row is Ndiaye, who will speak probably a little bit also about the e-learning platform Exploring Economics. Thank you, Ndiaye, for joining us.
Thank you, Claudius, and thank you for having me here. Let me just share my screen. I also prepared a little presentation, and what I want to talk about today with you are 4 lessons learned when we set up Exploring Economics, because I think that the question of what needs to change in macroeconomics and also in the discipline is closely related to the evolution of our platform. Before I do that, I want to show you some figures. Claudius also mentioned some. So we are an e-learning platform that presents content in a pluralist way. And we launched almost 4 years ago and are available in 4 different languages. And I checked the numbers this morning, so we're up to over 26,000 users now from the last 30 days. And you can see a heat map here where you can see where the users are coming from. So in the last 30 days, most of the users are from Mexico, the US, but also India and Germany. But as you can see, we reach out to the whole world, and we'll also try to include the whole world, a point which I will come to later. So what's the first lesson learned from Exploring Economics? Well, when we set up the platform, one of the main questions was, we set up the platform as students, and one of the main questions was, what else is there besides neoclassical economics? Because that's what we learned in our lectures, and we did our research. We were looking at different schools of thought, and we had, it was a huge puzzle for us, how to put those different schools into context, how to compare them. And a way which seemed a reasonable way for us was to compare those different perspectives using the differences in philosophy of science. And I will show you now how this is relevant for macroeconomics and how this is important for the future as well. One question of philosophy of science it's an ontological question, that is, where do you actually start doing science? At what or at who do you look at? Do you look at individuals, such as neoclassical economics with the methodological individualism? Or do you look at systems, for example, like complexity economics? And what we learned from the great financial crisis is that it's very valuable to take different perspectives into account, because from complexity economics, we could learn that there's not only too big to fail, there's also too connected to fail, for example. A phenomena that you can't arrive at this conclusion if you just take the framework of neoclassical economics. And I think it's important for different issues to take into perspective different perspectives. And this is also true for a more recent topic. Well, sometimes I get the answer to the comparison of the different schools of thought that it's not really necessary anymore to look at different schools of thought, because economics evolved. We have the empirical turn, and we don't look at different schools of thought. We look at topics and we see how they relate to reality. And what I want to show you now is why I think this is partly wrong. And I think this came apparent during the Black Lives Matter movement, and maybe some or most of you noticed an open letter by Bill Spriggs. Bill Spriggs, he had an open letter where he criticized the profession, and where he said, I'll just read the quote. If you start with a model that has race as exogenous, racial differences cannot be objectively approached. The model begins with a fallacy that assumes racial differences as a natural order. And later, I hope that we will join other social science and accept that race is a social construct. And the thing is, what Bill Spriggs highlights here is something fundamentally connected to philosophy of science. Can we actually observe the world as it is, or do we actually also construct the world? And how does this actually influence what we do? So another infographic from Exploring Economics is on exactly that question. Can we see the real world and talk about it, or only about the interpretations we make of it? And we see that the most popular approaches like neoclassical economics, for example, and behavioral economics, they are on this realistic side. And of course, maybe also because of that, the empirical turn is so popular. So what we learned from this is that it's very valuable to take different perspectives into account and critically assess their philosophy of science to actually see if they have some blind spots. And it's very important to be open to different approaches. So the second lesson learned is that for us, it's very important to amplify voices of people who are not heard. I don't have to explain this in detail. All of you know that economics has many issues when it comes to the hierarchy, when it comes to the tyranny of the top five, and how Western perspectives shape the discipline, and the lack of diversity. Also, as Abdi just mentioned this. And we also try to approach this issue in our online platform. And the good thing is we can work on these issues, and we can promote content from people who are often not heard. So one section of our website is, so you could call it the Netflix for pluralist economics, because we gather content from all over the web and we put it together. And we also promote content from people who are often not heard. But somebody has to decide on what actually comes onto the page, and we do this with our editors. We have editors working in different working groups, and we actively encourage people from the Global South to engage as editors to decide what actually comes on as content on the page. So the good thing is you can do that too. You can do that in your daily life by organizing a research seminar and inviting people there. Or we have heard the example of Abdu, which was very good, a very good how-to on how to organize the next conference. So the third issue, the third lesson learned I want to highlight is it's important to highlight topics that are sometimes not even mentioned. I assume most of you have seen this table. There's a table that shows the number of articles ever published on climate change in the most important, or in economic journals. And as you can see, the numbers are embarrassing. The Quarterly Journal of Economics with 0 articles in August 2019. It's pretty obvious that something needs to change there, and something can change. We do that in our Netflix section by highlighting, for example, racism and economics, or degrowth and ecological economics, and many other topics where we did a special something like a special issue on these topics. And you can do that too, also, again, in your research seminars and conferences. So Last but not least, one of the lessons learned is that it's important to build alliances, to form networks, and to open new discussion spaces. And I think this conference is a wonderful example for that. And if you like, you can also consider collaborating with us. We have different options to do so. One option is if you are a professor, you can, for example, become a teaching fellow. Maybe you did your own homework. You designed a new course that is also progressive, innovative, whatsoever. If you did something like that, please send us your syllabus, get in touch with us, and we can see how we can work together. It's also possible to submit content for our Netflix session as a section of our platform, or to submit MOOCs. Maybe you have an online course that you want to share with us, or even books. And also, last but not least, please engage your students, encourage your students to engage. I think it was Max Planck who said, science advances one funeral at a time. So we may not forget the youth and get the youth involved, get ideas from them, and we are trying to do so. So students, PhD students, and also assistant professors, if they find the time, are very welcome to join us to submit content, review content, or even creating content. So to sum up, we have 4 lessons learned. It's important for us to offer different perspectives, to amplify the voices of the people who are often not heard, to highlight topics relevant for ecological integrity and human well-being, and to build alliances for the collaborative advantage. Thank you, and I give the mic back to Claudius.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. I think this is really excellent stuff you're doing there. We already got a question for you, but I would put that back until everyone has presented, because I think it can be framed in a way that everybody has something to say about that, which is I would like to give Cecilia the opportunity to give a presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Claudius, for the presentation, and also I should thank the previous presentations, because I was kind of counting on you and take the advantage of being the last one, just to say that I subscribe to the discussion that preceded me, and also to change a bit the angle of the discussion, just like considering that everything that was said previously in this session is something that we all agree on, and that's why we are gathering, and that's why we think macroeconomics and economics in general should be rebuilt. I must say that I'm particularly glad to be here, because it allows me to, let's put it in these words, come clean about why I think, or why I try to avoid answering what I call tagging questions, or driving on what Carlo Di Politi said earlier today. I avoid clan questions, meaning that I avoid the questions that when you're asked, like, are you a macroeconomist or a microeconomist, or are you a Marxist, or what's your school of thought? And I try to avoid these questions precisely because I think that tagging beforehand, and probably tagging in general, but I'm going to focus on how we tend to work in economics, and macroeconomics also in particular. This tagging beforehand dodges theoretical debates, and this goes to the point where we risk losing general perspectives. And these general perspectives, I think that they are super urgent for dealing with any economic question. I'm of course not saying that I expect everyone to be working on every single topic. This would be a misinterpretation of what I'm trying to share with you today. But tagging ourselves, sometimes even before formulating problems, has consequences for our understanding. Once the tagging is done, then the next thing is just to lock oneself into that subdiscipline or field. And this means that we only attend a certain type of conferences, we only read certain type of journals, or even we only read the journals that are addressing that particular field from the school of thought where we are writing from. And then, of course, as it was also pointed out earlier today in a previous session, I think it was also Carlo Di Politi, we tend to cite the same people. In particular, those who are the gods or the most recognized authors, generally white male, and I will not follow on that, but just to keep it in mind, within the tagging we choose. So we chose a tagging, and then we just proceed in this way. And of course, tagging is in many cases a survival strategy, especially in a discipline with huge bottlenecks, as it is for the case of economics, and in particular for those of us working on the research field. So tagging, I think that is a particularly relevant discussion for macroeconomists, also because, and this I believe is a direct influence of mainstream economics, doing macro or micro, of course with the mainstream method, is seen like, okay, this is the real economics. If you do macro or micro, then you're doing economics, but all the rest could vanish, even from curricula, as it happens in some cases. But micro and macro are like the backbones of economics. And this hierarchical view makes tagging even more dangerous for actually tackling the major problems of our epoch. So this is why I think we should stop a bit before moving forward into answering questions to actually discuss or reflect on why we tend to constantly tag ourselves. Because the result, and this is not only for macroeconomics, but for tagging in general, is that we lose the whole picture. We lose how our contributions fit into what could be summarized in 2 words as the development of capitalism. And capitalism is a global in nature. It's not only global since globalization, but it's global in nature. And then, even though we may recognize what I have just said, then we should also reflect on what's macroeconomics' final aim then. What's macroeconomics for? Of course, knowledge, it should be enough to say that knowledge has just the sake of knowledge. But macroeconomics is also about providing policy recommendations. And it was pretty clear earlier in the discussions today and also in the previous panels. And providing policy recommendations to political powers, typically the state, it can be to other institutions. And since the state is supposed to be sovereign within its borders, then we focus on economic relations inside a country and also on the relations of that country with the rest of the world. So just by doing that, we're losing this global perspective. And you will say, but we are looking at the relation of the country with the rest of the world. But what I'm trying to say here is that the focus is what's going on in the country. It's the country that is the subject matter, and the rest is only taken into account in relation to the country and not beyond that relationships. And this, when we say this, we are actually hiding a few assumptions. There is one that I think that is pretty clear for everyone here, which is that we don't have a representative country, of course. And it's not the same thing to do macroeconomics for a developed country than for a peripheral country, and there are many nuances in between. But there is another assumption, and this is the one I want to focus here, and is to assume that we can provide valuable policy recommendations at the country level or regional level, but only looking at what's going on or thinking that the country is the subject matter and its relations with the rest of the world. And I truly think that providing accurate policy recommendations requires an understanding of global capitalism. And this is not the addition or sum of the countries. It's not how we see what's going on in capitalism from the perspective of a country, but it really needs to go and look into the globally interconnected system that is organized under the same production relations. I'm in Argentina now, and commodity production and exchanges takes place just like in the UK or in the rest of the world. And since globalization, this became all the more true. Of course, supply chains, innovation networks take place at a global level. And when we look at the digital transition, this is even more apparent. So there is a general dimension of society that needs to be understood as much as there are also many local and regional dimensions and specificities. I was saying that I'm from Argentina, and this means that I am based in a peripheral country. And of course, this requires unpacking a lot of these global dimensions into the specificities of Argentina. And there are also further specificities by being Argentine in particular, because it's not just any peripheral countries, one of the countries, or probably the country with the biggest history of defaults, structural inflation, so on and so forth. And I will give you, so just in a word, what I'm trying to say is the challenge for macroeconomists is to be generalist and specialist at the same time. How to cope with this complicated scenario where we need to know what's going on in the whole world, understand the key concepts of how economics works. And when I say economics, I'm not constraining myself to the country view, but global economics work, and then go and deal with the specific topics we are arguing and discussing. And I will give you a quick wrong example of the consequences of being narrow-minded, and it concerns Argentina again. You probably heard that once again, we are in a serious debt crisis. And to pay, the quest for easy access to dollars has led the government, which is a progressive government, to promote all the extractivist industries in the middle of a climate change crisis. Fossil fuels, in particular fracking techniques, open cast mining, even having pig farms for China, and in the midst of a pandemic and raising pigs in an industrialized way that can generate zoonotic diseases. So the government is ultimately bearing the country's sustainability and development chances, also making the world worse for the rest. Everything just because they're having this narrow-mindedness of we need dollars and we need them right now. So all the macro policies are addressed to getting more dollars, and also industrial policies and so on. So how can we not lose this systemic or generalist perspective? And I think here, and this will be in direct connection to what Daniel was saying, we need more theoretical, philosophical discussions before jumping into tagging, modeling, doing empirics, and so on. And to that end, I think that we should start by mapping the most challenging and pressing problems of our time. And this, we should do it in more detail, and we should focus on the connections between them. I don't have the time to do it, but let's just think of, I don't know, climate change, inequalities, racism, underdevelopment, patriarchy, the rise of extreme right, the pandemic, knowledge privatization. They're all global issues. They're all interconnected, and they all at the same time have specificities in different countries and regions and so on and so forth. Think of the interplays of financialization and globalization together with tax evasion, avoidance, with the increased concentration of intangible assets in a few hands. We cannot understand all these major problems without having a global perspective, and we need this global perspective to provide not only valuable policy recommendations for the states, and this is my final thought on these. I think that macroeconomics has the chance to reinvent itself, not only addressing policies, but also people, not only mainly recommending states, but empowering other organizations. Think of unions, grassroots movements. And it should contribute, I think, to provide the links between these general understandings and the specificities of this general understanding and understandings for countries and regions. And I think that both the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the EPOC Masters programs have these aims in mind, are driven by these aims of being at the same time generalist and specialist. And I would be happy to share with you more about them in the Q&A section if you're interested in them. But I just thought that doing somehow of a provocative talk, given that I assume that we are all together in this need for more pluralism and diversity and so on, could spark some debate and discussions. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Cecilia. We already have a number of interesting questions. The panelists do not have to look at the chat. I will do that for you, and I will read the questions to you. And I think I already tried to group them in a little bit, and try to pose them to all the relevant people. So there were a couple of questions for Daniel, but I think they are also interesting for the others. So Angus was interested in what do you think about the future of the big five journals, taking into account what you have learned about them by using the bibliometric technologies you were exploiting in your talk. And maybe I would like to combine this with a question about what role do the Big Five play in terms of inclusiveness, and what Abdu would say about the role of the Big Five in economics, taking into account his experience with organizing the conference he was talking about. Maybe we can start with these two questions and then move on to the next ones.
Yeah, thank you, Claudius and Angus and everyone who asked questions, I think, and all the presenters, Daniel and Cecilia. So like, yeah, the top five, as we know, tyranny of the top five, right now it's more playing a role of signaling and kind of a survival strategy for junior people to get tenure rather than playing its role of disseminating research and being like a tool for vetting what is good science or not. We find that papers get published 7 years after they get started, and people are actually citing working papers 4 years before they get published. So we have a very long delay between when these papers get written and are relevant to when they are published, because the top five are here to play a role of providing scarcity. Like we are economists, we tend to think that whenever there is scarcity, it allows to have market mechanisms. But I think with COVID, we found the necessity of having publications coming to market sooner so that it can be used, so that it can go to not only be a conversation between researchers, but also involving the people and the broader audience. And so a lot of journals are now expanding, accepting shorter papers. And, like Esther Duflo has mentioned recently, that she is open to having more papers in the American Economy Review, and that the issue right now is a lot of some kind of cultural issues with reviewers, referees just being too harsh. So I think, the top five is still playing an important role of gatekeeper, which is unfortunate, of being used more as a signaling device of who is good or who is not, rather than as a tool to disseminate good science versus bad science. So, but there are good, I think the trend is going into, is positive, I think, that people are being aware of that there is an issue with the top five. And Daniel's table showing that climate change is not mentioned, for example, in QJE and in some journals, is actually very striking. Is something that once people become more aware of, with the advent of some technology that people have embraced now, Twitter has improved the conversation a lot, that now people can see what, when there are issues like this. So I think that graph is even important to disseminate. So I think, the roll forward is having less role for top five and more role for just broader journals in general. And this is related also to what Cecilia was talking about, the fact that only some papers are cited. The issue is that people do not read papers like in some fields. We focus more on reputation as a signaling tool, and that's what we're trying to get rid of also when trying to look at papers more deeply in our review process. So I think, all that, there are some important cultural shifts, but always work in progress.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe Daniel, can you also respond to the question posed before?
I very much agree with what Abdu says. The question was posed in the chat if technology could maybe be a solution, and even though I consider myself as a digital nerd or whatsoever, I always say when it comes to technology as a solution, technology can almost never be a solution. It can only support processes and relations that are already there. And I think the same is true for the top 5 journals. This is not a technological issue and something that can be technological changed, but it's a thing thinking about power relations, as Abdu says, about signaling and so on. And I mean, I experienced that during my studies when I chose my master's topic. I wanted to write something similar to a paper I found in, well, it was published in not a good journal, so to say. And the professor said, well, it looks kind of interesting, but take a paper from the top 5 and write your thesis about that. So I went to another professor and actually wrote on the topic. I stick with my topic, but it's a cultural change, and it's a thing that has to change with everyone in education and in the publishing process. And I think this is very important to be aware of.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. I would like to proceed with the next by putting together a next sum of questions, because a lot of questions, a lot of what you were talking about was referred to increasing pluralism in economics. So Panka was asking Daniel, do you have any strategy to support people to promote pluralism in economics in the countries where the reach of exploring economics is still limited? And I would like to combine this with another question of exploring economics with regard to how people perceive it, because Kisha was expecting heterodox economics to be more enthusiastic than mainstream ones. And I would like to combine this also with a question to Cecilia, who was talking a lot about getting rid of tax and taking more general perspectives. And I think people would be interested in what you are saying about how you perceive the approach of exploring economics, where tagging takes place quite explicitly, but nevertheless, one tries to present these things in an integrated manner to the students. So maybe these 2 questions for both of you for the next round, and then I will try to group new questions after your answers.
Yeah, so to the question, how do we gain attention in countries that we might want to gain attention? I think it's very important to, as I said, build allies. So, for example, when we try to reach out to people from the global south, we are working together, for example, with Rethinking Economics. There's, for example, Rethinking Economics in Africa, and we ask them what to do, actually. And sometimes we are very lucky, and there are very motivated people who organize a writing workshop or something else, and we are happy to publish the results of that. So reaching out to networks is, I think, very important to the promotion and to outreach for a better outreach. When it comes to the question, how are we perceived by the mainstream? I have to say, not so bad, because our approach is quite appealing, because we don't say neoclassical economics is wrong, is fundamentally wrong, and we have a better approach, but we have more of an inclusive approach, where we say we have different schools of thought, they differ in terms of their philosophy of science, and whether you take this program decision as your fundament of your research, or this, or if you make this decision, this is not right or wrong. There is no right or wrong when it comes to philosophy of science, but our point is to be aware of these major decisions that take place before you start your research. And this is the thing that actually everybody can agree on. Of course, not everybody is enthusiastic and also wants to collaborate with us, but yeah, we're working on it.
Great, thank you. So maybe Cecilia, can you?
Yes, sure. So I will just address the last question, which was more focused on what I was saying, because at the same time I was actually looking at the chat, and there are so many questions, and I was already typing like things that I want to say, but I will not jump into that before you, Claudius, give us the mic to answer those questions. But just to say on this last point of what do I think about exploring economics, I think that as a learning platform is key, is super important. Like every student, every young scholar, and also for non-economists, everyone should know that there are different schools of thought. My point was more like, what's next? That's why I said that I subscribe to everything that was said before, but I wanted just to do, I don't know, to move one step forward and say, okay, taking all this for granted, what's the next move? What we should do next? And what I think we should do next concerns not only cross-fertilization between different schools of thought, and it does not only concern going back to key authors of the history of economic thought, not at all. I mean, we can, of course, derive inspiration from all that, but we need to build new theory that is based on the previous one. And also, the next thing to say in relation to this is that we should not only think of what's beyond our school of thought or field in economics, but also try to think more broadly in an interdisciplinary way. If we are addressing, like, I'm pretty sure that all the problems we want to tackle have other perspectives from sociology, political sciences, anthropology, philosophy, of course, and other disciplines as well. So we should also try to remain broad in that respect. And I will give you just one example of how the EPOC master course does it. So the EPOC has different majors and minors, but I'm not going to focus on that now. The main idea of how we can keep that the EPOC uses to keep the generalist perspective is one course that is called joint seminars. It's a huge burden because it's like 50 seminars per semester for in the second year for master students. But there, each time students receive a scholar or a policymaker or an activist or someone from a private firm, and it's not only economists that are invited, but people in general that are working on relevant topics related to the masters, which is broadly related to all the global transitions. So it covers a wider diversity of topics. And these joint seminars are open. So when they took place in the past in Paris, they were open and everyone could join. And if in I don't know what will happen now, but if they take place in online, the same thing will happen. So just to say that we should drive inspiration from many different sources, and we should build a capacity to be critical also. It's not just saying everything is okay and I will just go look around and just apply whatever it best suits the data I have and that's it. It's also about when I think of pluralism, I think it also about looking into the failures, the mistakes of some of the theories and try to overcome them, explain why those are failures and how can that be explained in a better way.
Okay, thank you very much, Cecilia, for these clarifications. I have three open questions here. One was directly also dedicated to Cecilia, and since it deals directly with what you just said, I think it's a good way for you to just jump in again. Gary wanted to know that while you are talking about the need for macroeconomists to be generalists as well as specialists, it is that he says, is it also about a need to understand the world economy as a structure of power as well as economic exchange? In other words, he is asking you whether you are basically calling macroeconomics to become political economy in a classical or old-fashioned way. I suppose you have some clarifications to make there.
Yeah, well, I think that every science is political. Because it's done by scientists, we cannot get rid of where we come from, our aims, intentions. And one of the worst things that we have inherited from mainstream is this idea that we can build neutral models that are just fed with data and then the result is completely neutral and we have nothing to do with that. And we are just techniques working with those specific models. So in that respect, yes, capitalism is deeply rooted in power relations. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Many times when we are recommending policies, we recommend wishful thinking, things that we would all love to happen, but we don't really take into account the feasibility of those policy recommendations. So I understand that sometimes it's just about to say, okay, this should happen this way, and just to make people reflect on, okay, but it's not happening that way, why? But at the same time, I think we should be more responsible in showing the path or how can that today is not feasible, could eventually be feasible, or if it's not, to acknowledge why within the current system we're living in, that's not feasible. I'm not saying, as I think I replied before, that these answers can be found in Smith, Ricardo, or Marx, even though I do think that they have a lot of things to teach us, and not only young generations, but economists in general. But one of the most important lessons that we can learn from them is this generalist perspective, as well as their critical aim. And criticizing is not saying you are bullshit and then I do something different. Is committing with the author and trying to show where the author failed and try to move forward.
Okay, I think David Chester is somehow unhappy with your view on the politics of science, but I would like to take up another question for the moment that was meant for all panelists. Joao was generally asking, what role could the cross-fertilization of ideas coming from different economic thoughts play in the rebuilding of macro? I would personally add to this question, what role could the cross-fertilization of disciplines play for the rebuilding of macro, and where do you see the challenges of such increased diversity? I would pass the question as a first person to Abdul, because I think also his experience with this conference, which was mainly meant as being inclusive towards different groups and identities, if I understood him correctly. So it would be interesting what he would say about this inclusiveness with regard to theories, methods, etc. And then maybe the other two could also say something about the question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, about cross-fertilization and diversity of perspectives and fields. Yeah, I think this is related to the earlier question. And one of the issues with the tagging and the uniformity sometimes is that it starts with the curriculum of how we teach economics, and we think of it as a field of its own, the field of economics. And my view is more like economics is a collection of different fields. And I subscribe to the idea of Keynes in his own words saying that the economist should be a mathematician, a historian, a statesman, and a philosopher to some degree. So I see it more as it requires this kind of being a generalist, and while also focusing on a particular topic. But at the same time, this creates us challenges because being a generalist is difficult, and it's very easy to just be like a kind of a broad without depth. So that's why it should start from the way in which economics is taught, to rethinking the curriculum so that we can have both breadth and depth at the same time in people who are doing economics. But yeah, like, so in terms of macro and how kind of different perspectives have been coming in, I think there have been some improvements. Like I said, macroeconomics is what macroeconomists do. And what we have observed is that once you have seen more women doing macroeconomics, for example, you have seen more papers on issues that women care more about. Historically, for example, labor, education, issues about consumption, household macroeconomics have become more important rather than just the macroeconomics that looks at monetary policy and just kind of financial issues. So this has been also a shift, and you can see that there have been more and more papers that where we involving marital issues, gender within macroeconomics. There have been also some developments, there are still more developments to do, but it has been some also tied to our level of methodology that we have to deal with complex issues, because economics is a complex problem. I come from engineering before, where when you work in physics, things are in a sense more defined for us and more defined problems that we can work on. And now economics has this complexity where it involves humans, so you have behavioral aspects and so on, and also kind of the way in which we are all interlinked. The demand of someone is the supply of other people, so it's more complex. But we have seen, like in the panel about disequilibrium in economics, and now people are thinking of economies with multiple agents and like heterogeneity. To make this work, we needed some methodological contributions from mathematicians and so on. Now, for the studies of race and racism, people need to be inspired from some contributions in sociology So this requires collaborations between fields. So overall, to answer this question, what I would say is that when you have different people doing macroeconomics, you will have different topics studied. Now, there are more topics that need to be studied. For example, climate change needs to be studied. And I would even add that with the overflow of information now, we're thinking of how attention matters, because our usual assumption is that knowledge is free, but really you pay attention. And so how do we think of attention and the overflow of information? How do we think of some other relevant outcomes, like when Cecilia said that we only care about the dollar amounts, but we can think of health as an outcome of its own. We can think of mental health of it as an outcome of its own. And maybe someday we're going to think of mindfulness in general as an outcome of its own once we see that there are a lot of problems within our society. So I believe that, you know, we do not need to break everything that has been done and kind of incremental change with like just providing more effort in thinking of these, but we need methodological contributions that are appearing daily. And one great example, like when we saw the example of Ben Moll, who had been able to use some methodological contributions in mathematics, for example, to think of heterogeneous agents, people, inequality within macro, which is now started to influence monetary policy in many different central banks. So I believe we will have more of that in behavioral economics, in economics of the family, and in even mindful economics in general. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniel, Cecilia, is somebody of you wants to directly engage with what Abdul said with regard to the question of Joao, or?
I may add a word on interdisciplinarity, which is quite challenging also because of how we learn at universities, and we are always taught to try to focus, and I don't, well, maybe in the US it's different at college, but in general, well, as we move forward in our careers, it comes, I mean, it's obvious that climate change is a global issue and it should be addressed by multiple disciplines, but how can we actually collaborate and do some research work together? And I just wanted to share a small example of part of the research that I've been doing. I work with two biologists, a linguistic and a specialist in public sciences, on mapping the research agenda of health and biomedical sciences, mapping it both from the most cited with highest impact factor journals, and mapping the actors there to show that big pharma companies are actually part of the main actors of that research agenda. And we took advantage of working with biologists and of course with the linguistic as well to also acknowledge the content of that research agenda. And we found that, of course, what everybody knows, but it's never been shown in that way, when you do network analysis of the most frequent multi-terms that belong to the titles, abstracts, and so on of the papers, you find that the topics that are mostly being addressed are the, let's say, core countries' diseases for the rich people, like cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and the approaches, the way this is being researched is with molecular biology. And they're not taking into account the context, the ambience where these diseases proliferate and so on and so forth. And the type of the infectious diseases like the coronavirus had no place in the major journals. And in the paper, we also look at how that affects a developing country or peripheral country research agenda that is not directly linked and not directly publishing on these mainstream journals. And it's something that also happens to us in economics. We may not publish in the top 5 journals, but still we are completely driven by their methods, their research questions, and so on. So just to point out that it is possible to think of research questions that are interesting from a political economy or macroeconomy or microeconomy or any economic perspective, and still learn from other disciplines and build together interesting results, or what I think at least are interesting results.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would maybe like to add an example from myself, where I was working with ethnologists and sociologists together. This interdisciplinary is often very difficult. I mean, you get a lot of payback if you are successful, but at least myself, it took a lot of time in order to get this group working and to understand myself how these other people think about explaining a certain phenomena. So interdisciplinary comes with obvious costs, in particular in the scientific system we are operating right now. I think this is also something where rebuilding macroeconomics as an institution was really important, because that's the funding agency that actually accepts this and that gives you a benefit. If I apply with an interdisciplinary project to a conventional funding agency, usually you do not stand a chance against disciplinary approaches because of the way research gets evaluated at these issues. And I think this is a serious impediment with regard to changes in macroeconomics, but science in general. I have one open question, which is dedicated to Cecilia, but because you were talking now, I would put that back and ask it later. Otherwise, there were no questions to the panelists directly, so I would put one from my question box and encourage the people to ask more questions. And the question goes to all three of you, obviously. And I would be interested, you personally, from your experiences, where do you see the major obstacles with regard to important changes in macroeconomics? Do you consider them more on the individual level, like that people are not interested enough, that they do not know enough about potential cross-fertilizations from other disciplines, etc.? Or do you see structural hindrances to be more important? So things like stereotypes, the use of rankings, unequal distributions of resources. Where do you see the major obstacles towards the necessary changes in macroeconomics, also towards more diversity? Maybe Daniel, you want to start because you were the last person talking, and again the invitation to the audience to pose more questions.
Well, it's a big question, right? Not easy to answer. So I think that it's an interplay of individual and structural obstacles. So I mean, I learned many things myself when I was a student. Of course, I said, how can that be that we are learning things from the standard textbook, and this seems so out of date. And now doing my PhD and doing seminars and lectures myself, I figured that there's actually no time for preparing an alternative. It's not even laziness; it's a lack of time, and it needs lots of effort to change something. And this is, of course, probably true for everyone involved in the profession. So there are some things that are individual, but of course, as Abdu said, if you want to get tenured, you have to go for the top 5 or for the top field journals, and there's a cultural, as I said before, a cultural shift needed. And a cultural shift is not an easy thing to do. But what I also see, besides that seeming to be impossible, is that there's a huge discussion going on various issues in economics on Twitter, so on also conferences and so on and so forth. And I think the acknowledgement of these issues is a good first step and a necessary first step in order to overcome these obstacles.
Okay, thank you very much, Abdul. Do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I want to add just some, like just the perspective that to complement what Daniel just said. I think there is one element that we forget sometimes that kind of defines the culture of economics. So which comes to this institutional issue, which is that most economists, or at least in terms of what is the mainstream, and also people who kind of guiding the discussion, who are in the top institutions and who are representing these top journals, either are trained in the US or work at institutions in the US. And also research in the US tend to be kind of favored. You see, and sometimes I see reviews papers of people who are all in European institutions writing a paper about the US. So the US is kind of playing a predominant role in economics, and this also leads to kind of the culture and how the US view, like kind of this emphasis on capitalism and a certain approach to society and topics kind of dominating the conversation. And we mentioned earlier why, you know, the view like, you know, that there is this capitalist issues that are studied within economics. So I think that creates a big institutional issue of how to think of pluralism within economics. And now, from what I see from the individual perspectives is that often individuals are pushing back against these big structural blockages, and which is sparking the change. And so there is kind of a civil society within economics that is trying to push for this change. And I think there are good developments on this in the recent years. But I just wanted to mention this, and how do we want to think of this kind of exorbitant privilege that, you know, the US has, not only through currency, but also through research, and how do researchers from other places think of this? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Cecilia, when you answer the question, maybe you can also take into account what Caroline was asking to you, because she posed a similar question. She was asking whether people are not structurally enforced to self-label them, and whether it's structurally easier for mainstream economists to say, okay, we don't need to be tagged, just let everybody do whatever he or she wants. But that for heterodox economists, this labeling becomes important, or is even enforced upon them by others, which I would say is to some extent one of the structural features that may work as a hindrance. Maybe you can take this into account when answering the more general question.
Sure. To begin with, I think that why we adopt all these constraints and we just follow the crowd, I think it's because we want a job. In the end, it's about that. It's because we want to finish the PhD, we want to get a tenure position, and as I said when I was presenting these ideas, there is a huge bottleneck, and the good positions are scarce, and in particular for those seeking for good positions in core countries is even more complicated, because this, like publishing in the 5 top journals, it's something that not even in France is taken into account for getting a tenure position. I am entitled to apply for tenure positions because there they have a 2-step process. First, you need to apply to be like entitled to apply for the actual positions, and once you get that habilitation, then you can apply. And I got that that habilitation, but I didn't apply because I chose to come back. But in any case, I don't have a paper in any of those 5 journals, and it's never been my aim. I understand that for some people it may be, but if I would say that it's possible to have tenureship without publishing there, and then of course it's not a matter of individuals, and I totally understand that getting a job is of utmost importance, and I'm not neglecting that. I'm just saying that this is both an organizational change, a change that needs to take place at organizational levels, and we need to build networks, and we need to build alliances, as Daniel was saying, and places like all the organizations we've been discussing here are super important, and Rebuilding Macro is super important for this. But on top of that, there is an individual change that needs to take place, at least for those of us who were lucky enough to listen other stories. Because those that were trained only on mainstream economics probably think that that's the only thing that it exists. It was like that for me until, like in Argentina, we have 5-year undergraduate degrees, and until the 3rd year, I had never heard that there was something else from my mainstream economics. Actually, what I learned was that there was something else, but not what else was out there. So for those of us who are lucky at some point, we should try to engage in a way and change things. Of course, I still understand that these are constraints, these are social constraints that we inherit. But at the same time, we should try to collectively empower ourselves to move beyond them. I will give you another example. I have nothing against econometrics, but it's just that I think that if we narrow the methods too much, we are also narrowing our chances to truly understand what's going on in the world. And that's why I implicitly decided that I'm going to avoid publishing papers with econometrics. And I managed to publish in good journals, or at least, of course, not those 5, because they were never inside my radar. And I know that even if Esther Duflo says that they're going to be more open, I challenge her to publish things with qualitative studies that are not randomized controlled trials or econometric models and so on and so forth. But anyway, I think that it's possible. I just think that we need to help each other, and we need to try, and to do that, we also need to do things like having journals that are open also to methods, to disciplines, and so on, mapping those journals. There are lists of critical journals that are way more open than those 5. If we keep citing those 5, if we keep looking at those 5, then even if we are not part of the US, we are part of the US discussion all the time. So yeah, I would encourage people to try to be more bold on this, and just to show that it's possible to get a position when, and I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible.
I would like to take up what you just said, and because there's a question from Jean-Christophe. He was asking, what can we do to build career path for young macroeconomists that do not rely on publishing in the top 5 and everything associated with it? And he is asking not only us as individuals, but also what would we expect from organizations just as Rebuilding Macro to help this process? I personally also already indicated that I think that Rebuilding Macro is important because it appreciates efforts just as interdisciplinarity or pluralism, which usually are downgraded in conventional outlays, and which are nevertheless important in order to get a job. But I would be interested to ask also Daniel and Abdul, and then also again Cecilia, what they would answer to this question. So what, from your experience, would be important for young macroeconomists? What do they need in order to bring the change in macroeconomics and to get the jobs and institutional positions to bring about these changes, other than publishing in the top 5? So Daniel or Abdul, do you want to start?
I may start. I think it's a short answer as well. First of all, thank you, J. Christopher, for the question. I think, Claudius, you already said it's important to build networks, to provide resources for research that might seem unconventional. And you can also highlight this research, for example, by setting up prizes or things like that. I mean, probably most of you who were already involved in the hiring process for a new tenure professorship know that there are other factors besides the journals where you have published in. Of course, it's also important how many resources you got for your research projects and so on and so forth. And I think these are all factors where we can need support.
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of 2 things. So changing the incentives for young researchers, because at the end of the day, the young researchers will respond to, because they need essentially to survive. But even though individually they can define their own game that they play at, but the publish or perish game is the one in which is like the survival one that they tend to be drawn to. But we can change the culture by creating a culture of reading papers and actually going to the meat of what the papers talk about. Because at the end of the day, we need to be differentiating between what is good research versus what is not. And creating a culture of reading papers can allow to see someone's work more broadly than just how many top 5 there are. Because there are some top 5 papers that are very bad research that just try to address some question with like very strong econometric methods while actually being on very and interesting questions and have narrow answers. So I think the first thing is also having a culture of reading papers, which is not what we are incentivized to do, because also it kind of there is this publisher perish mentality that self-fulfills itself and reinforces itself of just, I'm gonna write a paper, submit, and move to the next one. And the other aspect is also we need a broader set of journals, and also, you know, like, of course, the impact and kind of seriousness of the journal still matters. So expanding the top 5, and also it is good developments that journals like the European Economic Review are becoming more and more important. And also this will kind of push against the dominance of just American journals to be interested in broader topics. So, you know, because you want to do robust research as well, it is a great development. I think also that you have more and more papers published that using great administrative data in some countries like Denmark or Sweden. And hopefully more and more of these papers will be published in other journals than these top 5s, like the European Economic Review and other European journals, and in cross and journals that are like across disciplines. So in health, you see a lot of people publishing in health journals as well. So, you know, I think there are incremental changes like this that need to be pushed more broadly in all directions. So I would say, you know, a change of culture of reading more papers and having a broader set of journals that publish good research, because at the end of the day as well, we want to be able to distinguish good research versus just any research.
Just one word, because I know we are running out of time. I would say that young scholars should push more senior scholars to do whatever they can to change the assessment, the evaluation criteria. And this goes especially for recruiting young scholars. I know that in some cases, they do efforts and they change what they're supposed to do, and they don't, in the case of the UK, they're not so obsessed with the ref and stuff like that. But we need to, in general, I think, push for that. Changes in the evaluation criteria will directly impact on the type of research we can do and how free, within constraints anyway, our research can be.
Great, thank you very much. I was again reminded that we have finished on time, so maybe as an absolute final word of everybody of you, could you maybe mention one thing in the past that made you really positive about the future development of macro, and one wonderful experience you had? And if you could wish for one thing for macroeconomics to happen in the next 2 years, what would it be? Please use these 2 questions as a final statement in this round and be quite quick about it. Thank you very much. Daniel, do you want to start?
Yes. So what makes me quite positive and enthusiastic about the future is that I can see way more collaboration and joint forces in the movement of pluralist economics. For example, the Network for Pluralist Economics in Germany is working closely together with Rethinking Economics, with Oikos, what you may know. And not only at the student side, but also, as we can see here in this conference, also on the professional side, people are starting to really seriously join forces. And in Germany, for example, there's the Forum New Economy, which gained quite some attention lately. And well, this is a good thing. And what I would like to see in the next 2 years is maybe some good alternatives to the standard 101 courses that are easily adaptable. Some are already there. There's, for example, Core, as you know. We show some of on exploring economics, and yeah, I hope there's more in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, so first about one thing that has happened is maybe now there is maybe more understanding of what is macroeconomics. For example, that I work on issues on macroeconomics, public finance, taxes, inequality, and so on. And that is considered as macroeconomics and respected as macroeconomics. So that's a good thing. And kind of in things that I think that are hopeful, that give me hope for a change in the future is that there are a lot of initiatives that people can go and look at and improve upon that are changing the conversation. So for example, in the previous panel, people were talking about GDP and how narrow it is. Now the US has introduced these distributional national accounts that do not only look at GDP, but how the pie is distributed, how the incomes have changed across different people over time, and looking at more broadly the issues of inequality and how inequality has been resolved or not as national statistics. Some countries for example, in the developed world has looked at question of GDP and thought that oh, we have a very large informal sector. How can we incorporate this informal sector within? How can we incorporate question like home care within GDP? So this would be something to think of. The Institute of New Economic Thinking have great initiatives. So how can we expand on these initiatives that are there to kind of change the conversation and improve on them, and rather than just stop at the criticism level, but think of bring these initiatives and be problem solvers. So that's my hope that things are going to improve a lot. In the terms of the publishing aspect, now there are a lot of these journals kind of accepting shorter papers, AR Insights, JPub, and many different journals bringing these new shorter papers with fast turnaround time. So how can we improve on this? Thank you very much for the
Thank you very much. I think we can steal Angus 30 seconds for Cecilia, so that
less than that. Instead I will twist the question. Instead of talking about the past, I will talk about the future, and I will just take this moment to invite you all to the YSI virtual plenary that will take place between November 6th and 15, and the main topic is new economic questions. And the main idea is that we will all build together a set of economic questions that are the most pressing, challenging, not necessarily new, but that are really inspiring for this time. And I invite you all to join and to submit questions as well.
Thank you very much to all three of you for having this hopeful and positive end to our discussion. Thanks a lot. And we are directly continuing with the next session, right?
Yes. Thank you, Claudius. Thank you for the amazing session. My head is spinning in a good way. It was just fantastic.